You've probably noticed how the label pro choice can make people flinch before you've even finished the sentence. It's one of those identities that gets read like a confession. Some people hear it and imagine compassion, others hear it and imagine coldness. But if you want the psychology behind pro choicers, you have to start with the truth most people miss. Many pro choice people aren't thinking about choice as a slogan. They're thinking about what it feels like to have your life, your body, your future, and your pain turned into a battlefield where strangers feel entitled to make decisions for you. For a lot of pro choicers, the core emotion isn't celebration, it's dread. Not dread of pregnancy itself, but dread of forced outcomes. Dread of a world where a complicated medical situation becomes a moral spectacle. Dread of being reduced to a vessel. Dread of being told that your circumstances don't matter because someone else's certainty matters more. When you believe that pregnancy is not a simple event, but a high stakes, life altering condition, choice stops sounding like indulgence and starts sounding like survival. Public health framing matters here because it's one of the places where pro choice psychology often roots itself. The World Health Organization describes abortion as a common health intervention and emphasizes that it is very safe when carried out using recommended methods and appropriate care, while also noting that around 45% of abortions globally are unsafe when access is blocked by barriers to quality services. If you truly internalize that, your brain starts to treat abortion restrictions less like moral protection and more like a predictable pathway to hidden suffering. The argument becomes less abstract. It becomes, if you deny safe options, you don't erase abortions, you distort them, you push them into risk, you turn desperate decisions into dangerous ones. That belief can generate a kind of moral urgency that feels almost haunted because it's not only about ideology, it's about fear of preventable harm. This is why so many pro choice people build their stance around harm, reduction, and autonomy. Their moral center is often do the least damage and do not force bodily sacrifice. They may believe that people will disagree about when personhood begins, and because that disagreement is real and persistent, the safest moral rule is to let the person who is pregnant decide what risks they can endure, what they can carry, and what they can survive. Not because it's easy, but because it's theirs. If you want to understand the darker psychological layer, look at what pro choicers often assume about power. Many pro choice people don't trust institutions to wield control gently. They don't trust lawmakers to understand medical complexity. They don't trust strangers to weigh the details of rape, incest, fetal anomalies, abusive relationships, poverty, mental health, and medical emergencies with the nuance required. They don't trust systems that have historically punished women and marginalized people to suddenly become fair when given more authority over bodies. So the pro choice stance becomes a boundary against the state itself, a refusal to hand over the most intimate form of control. This distrust can harden into something colder, a sense that once you allow forced pregnancy in any form, you create a precedent that bodies can be commandeered for moral goals. And once that precedent exists, it doesn't stay neatly contained. Pro choice psychology often carries a slippery feeling fear that control expands, that exceptions shrink, that people become case studies instead of humans. It's the same psychological alarm people feel when any right becomes conditional on social approval. The fear isn't only the policy, the fear is that the door will open. And then there's the reality that many pro choicers have personal proximity to the issue. Sometimes they've had an abortion, sometimes someone they love has, sometimes they've lived through a miscarriage, an ectopic pregnancy, or a medical crisis that taught them how quickly pregnancy can become dangerous. Sometimes they've watched a friend be trapped by an abusive partner during pregnancy. Sometimes they've watched a teenager's life collapse under the weight of an outcome she didn't choose. Those experiences don't automatically make someone pro choice, but they often make the issue feel less like a debate and more like a memory. And people protect memories like they protect wounds. They don't want anyone else to be forced through what they barely survived. If you're listening and you've never had to imagine being pregnant when you didn't want to be, or staying pregnant, When your body is in danger, it might be hard to grasp the intensity, but pro choice intensity often comes from imagining it in detail, not in slogans and consequences. It comes from picturing the months, the medical bills, the job loss, the physical risk, the permanent tie to another person, the loss of time you never get back, the way your entire identity can become mother, whether you were ready or not. And when you picture that clearly, the idea of forcing it onto someone can start to feel like a form of quiet violence, even if it's justified by moral language. That doesn't mean pro-choicers are all the same. Some are primarily motivated by individual liberty, some by feminism, some by public health, some by religious pluralism, the belief that the law should not enforce one theological view of when life begins, some by skepticism of punishment-driven morality. But there's a common psychological thread. Many pro-choicers see the pregnant person as the primary moral agent, the one who will carry the outcome in their body, their life, their mind, and therefore the one who must retain decision-making power. If you accept that frame, it becomes hard to tolerate laws that treat pregnancy as something owed. In the United States, that psychological frame intensified sharply after the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, which held that the Constitution does not confer a right to abortion and returned the authority to regulate abortion to elected representatives. Even if you're not American, you've likely felt the ripple of what that symbolized, that legal rights can reverse, that long-standing norms can snap, that medical decisions can become political trophies. When rights feel reversible, people become more vigilant, more fearful, more identity-driven. For many pro-choice people, Dobbs didn't just change policy, it confirmed a suspicion about power, that control will be taken when it can be taken. And you can see that pro-choice sentiment is not fringe. In the United States, the Pew Research Center has reported that about 63% of adults say abortion should be legal in all or most cases, while about 36% say it should be illegal in all or most cases. That statistic doesn't prove anyone is morally right, but it does show something psychologically important. Pro-choice belief is often held by ordinary people who see themselves as moderate, pragmatic, and compassionate, not radical. When people realize they are not alone, they become more willing to name the belief out loud, and the belief becomes identity instead of private opinion. There's also a psychological reason pro-choice arguments often emphasize complexity. When you've seen enough real-life situations, you stop believing in clean categories. You stop trusting one-size-fits-all rules. You start hearing exceptions and thinking exceptions are not rare, they're life. Pregnancy is not a uniform event. It varies by health conditions, access to care, geography, finances, age, relationship stability, violence, mental health, and timing. So pro-choice people often develop an allergy to moral certainty, not because they have no morals, but because they believe certainty is dangerous when applied to other people's bodies. But there's another side that makes this topic feel eerie. The pro-choice position can also become a defense against shame. If you grew up in a culture that taught you a woman's worth is tied to sexual purity, motherhood, or sacrifice, then pro-choice belief can feel like rebellion against a script that demands suffering as proof of goodness. For some people, choice is the first time they've heard a moral permission slip that doesn't require self-punishment. And once someone experiences that permission, they cling to it because the alternative feels like being dragged back into a world where you're only lovable when you're obedient. Now, to be honest, pro-choice psychology can carry blind spots too. Some pro-choicers speak in ways that sound emotionally detached about something that is emotionally heavy for many people, including people who are pro-choice. The detachment is sometimes a coping mechanism, a way to keep the conversation from becoming unbearable. Sometimes it's also a way to avoid the moral discomfort that comes with acknowledging fetal development. Many pro-choice people resolve that discomfort by focusing on autonomy and on the practical consequences of restriction, rather than on metaphysical debates about personhood. It's not that they never think about it, it's that they don't want personhood arguments to become a weapon that overrides lived reality. And that brings you to the deepest psychological motive behind many pro choicers: the belief that in a world full of uncertainty, the only ethical place to anchor authority is inside the person who must live with the outcome. For pro choicers, the pregnant person is not a secondary character in a moral story, they are the story. Their body is not a battleground for other people's values. Their health is not collateral damage for a principle. Their life is not a lesson for society. So if you're listening as someone who is pro choice, the question underneath your belief might be: what do you fear most? Forced sacrifice, institutional control, preventable harm, or moral certainty used as a weapon? And if you're listening as someone who isn't pro choice, the question might be: can you see that many pro choicers are not celebrating abortion, but trying to protect a boundary they believe keeps real people from being consumed by other people's convictions? Because at its core, the psychology behind pro choicers is not a single personality type. It's a convergence of empathy for the living, distrust of coercive power, sensitivity to complexity, and a deep, almost primal insistence that your body is the one place no one else should be allowed to govern you. And when you understand that, you understand why this belief is so intense. It isn't just an opinion. For many people, it's the line between being a person and being a policy.